In the next video, we're going to install a VirtualBox hypervisor, and then we're going to set up a Linux Ubuntu virtual machine on it. So if you have a Windows machine or Mac OS like I do, you can follow this tutorial to set up a Linux virtual machine. Now, before we start installing the VirtualBox tool, I want to mention that in case you have any issues during the installation, I actually added a section where I go through some of the common issues that you may encounter during the installation, especially depending on which operating system you're using and installing VirtualBox on, and you may find a solution there. In this section, I want to go through some of the common issues that you may encounter during the installation, and I want to give you some options or alternatives to actually fix those issues or install or create your virtual machine in a different way. First of all, I want to start by saying that the main goal of the lecture is not to teach you how to use VirtualBox or generally how the virtual machine installation works, because you won't actually be doing that so often as a DevOps engineer, so you don't need that knowledge so much. The main goal is to learn Linux. So having a Linux machine available is actually the main focus of this lecture, so you can follow along the rest of the demos in this specific module. Throughout the rest of the bootcamp, we're actually going to be working with cloud platforms and creating virtual servers there, so you won't be working with virtual machines locally after this module. And this means if installing a virtual machine does not work, or you have any issues during this process when you're following the demo that I'm showing you, don't spend too much time on that. You can either spin up a simple virtual machine on a cloud platform, which I actually teach in the Cloud Basics module, and I'm going to link exactly the module and video number below this video so you can find it directly. Or if you don't want to pay the cloud platform yet, and if you want to actually wait until we get to that module, you can spin up a virtual machine for free on this online platform, and you'll have a Linux Ubuntu machine available through the browser. And this is actually going to be the easiest option. I will leave the link to this online platform below the video as well, so you'll find all this information there. So basically, find the easiest way to get a Linux machine and you're going to be good to go. If you already have a Linux distribution, and if you're working on a Linux computer or laptop, you don't need to install any VM at all. You can skip this part and you can do the demos in the following videos with your Linux operating system. I also want to mention that this is actually a very common issue with any technology or tool, and it's a common problem in IT that we all have to deal with called version compatibility. So in this case, you guys have different operating systems, different versions of operating systems, different hardware resources, etc. So there is no one solution fits all. So you may all have to do this in different ways. And VirtualBox is actually the most standard tool across all operating systems, and that's why I selected it, but it doesn't work for some specific cases. For example, the latest Mac OS version is not supported yet by VirtualBox. They will fix that in the future, but for now it's not working. So that's again a typical version compatibility issue where the one tool hasn't caught up with another tool yet. So for those cases, I want to suggest some alternatives to follow the demos without getting stuck here and interrupting your learning process. So here are a couple of suggestions. If you're on a Windows machine and the demo that I'm showing you is not working for you, first of all, please make sure you have virtualization enabled in BIOS. I will leave the resources below where you can see how that works for different Windows versions. And VirtualBox is actually the best VM tool for Windows. However, you will need some resources on your computer. And if you don't have enough CPU, enough RAM to allocate to your VM, then I suggest you go with a less resource-intensive option. For example, you can install WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux, which will require way less resources. And again, I will leave the links below this video for guides of how to install WSL. If you're on Mac, especially if you have the latest version of macOS operating system, or if you have the latest Mac hardware with M1 chip, the VirtualBox installation is not going to work for you. So I suggest two easy and better alternatives. The first one is installing UTM. That's a virtual machine tool for Mac OS, and another one which is called Parallels. They're both very easy to install and get started with. And again, I will leave all the links that show you how to install each one of them below this video. Another issue with VirtualBox that some students also encountered is installing the extension pack that basically lets you copy and paste between host and the virtual machine. So if that part is not working or you're getting an error during the installation, please check out the resource that I'm going to leave below this video for step-by-step guide of how to fix that. The final note on resources, as I also mentioned, many of you have different hardware resources. Generally, the more RAM and CPU you allocate to your virtual machine, the faster and more performant it is. So if you do have enough resources, then increase RAM and CPU for your VM when you're creating it. But if you're working with limited resources, for example, Windows operating system itself requires more resources than Linux, for example. So Windows machines are usually slower because they already use up a lot of the resources. So in that case, you may have some resource limitation. And as I suggested, in that case, please use some less resource intensive tool like WSL instead of the VirtualBox, or the online platform where you can spin up a virtual machine without having to install it locally. So overall, as I said, pick the easiest option and continue with the demos. I usually say that if something is not working, you should play around with it. This way you learn the tool better. But local virtual machine installation is not that important of a use case, so you can skip it and go with some easy option like the online virtual machine. So you can proceed with your learning. So first of all, we're going to need to download VirtualBox. So in Google search box, I'm just going to type in VirtualBox download, and we have this Oracle VirtualBox page. And here you have the latest package for different operating systems. So we have VirtualBox for Windows. So if you're on Windows, download this one. I have Mac OS, and that's the package I'm going to download. So I'm going to click on Install File. And since it's over 100 megabytes, it may take some time to install. Great, once that's done, I'm just going to click on that. And this should present us with a VirtualBox installation window. And to install it, I'm just going to double click on it. And we get this installation wizard. So we're just going to click continue without changing anything. Continue. It tells you how much resources it's going to need on your computer. We're going to do install and allow installing. And installation was successful. And that means we have VirtualBox now installed locally, so we can use it. Now, if you're on Mac, actually, there is one thing that you may need to configure for the VirtualBox installation to succeed. So if your installment actually failed, in the security and privacy settings here, you may have a prompt here that says, allow Oracle America basically to access your computer resources. So you will need to allow that and then do the installation again. So now I'm going to search for VirtualBox on my machine, and you see that it is installed. We have that application. I'm going to click on it, and we should see this VirtualBox Manager window. So basically we have this graphical user interface for VirtualBox to create the virtual machines and to manage them, basically to change any settings on them, to remove them, to create them, etc. Which of course makes it easy to work with virtual machines. Now, one prerequisite that I want to mention here when you're creating virtual machines on your computer is the prerequisite of resources. So you are going to need at least 4 gigabytes of RAM on your computer, because otherwise you may have some problems creating virtual machine. Because remember that we are sharing the hardware resources of the computer now among 2 computers, right? So your operating system, your host operating system, right, in this case Mac, is already using up some hardware resources. And on top of that, we're going to create another machine, which is going to require its own hardware resources. And 4 gigabytes of RAM, I would say, is really the lowest limit. So make sure you have that on your computer. Great. So next step is to actually prepare the environment for the virtual machine to be created. And for that, we're going to do new, and we're going to set all this up. And since we're creating a Linux virtual machine here, let's call it Linux Ubuntu. And you see that it basically intelligently detected from the name that I gave it that we want Linux, type of virtual machine here, and version is Ubuntu 64-bit. And this is basically where virtual machine will create the folders for the virtual machine configuration. And there is an option here to add an operating system ISO image to install on the virtual machine. We will leave this empty for now and upload the disk image after the VM is created in VirtualBox. And here is basically where we assign the virtual machine hardware resources. So this is going to be a virtual RAM that our Linux VM will get. And basically you can adjust this, but again, note that this shows you the entire RAM size that you have on your computer, and now you have to share some of that with the VM. I'm going to increase the allocated memory here to 4096 megabytes, which is around 4 gigabytes of memory, which I'm going to give to my Linux VM. It is also possible to allocate CPU resources to the virtual machine. If you have enough computing power on your local computer, you should actually allocate 4 gigabytes of RAM and 2 CPUs to the virtual machine to avoid any performance issues. And that is what I will do, and then click next. Here we will create a new virtual hard disk, and we can adjust the virtual hard disk or hard drive space size assigned to our VM. The default option I have here is 25 gigabytes. Although it is possible to allocate as little as 10 gigabytes, I actually recommend allocating at least 20 or even 30 gigabytes of storage if you have enough space on your host machine. There is an additional storage option shown by the checkbox here next to pre-allocate full-size hard disk. If you leave this box unchecked, the hypervisor will actually intelligently decide how much storage your virtual machine needs and basically dynamically set it, right? So if it doesn't need 10 gigabytes of storage, it's gonna allocate less. If it needs more storage, it's gonna request more storage from the host operating system. If you select pre-allocated full-size disk, then it will be allocated the entire 25 gigabytes, and that's it. We will leave the checkbox unmarked to set the storage to be dynamic and then click next. The summary page will show you the settings you have chosen, and you can click finish to create the virtual machine. Awesome. So you see that we have Linux Ubuntu, operating system, and we have all the settings here, the storage size, etc. displayed. Now what we did is actually prepare an environment for Linux virtual image to run on, right? So this is like a container, so to say, where we're gonna install Linux operating system. So we need to actually install Linux operating system on this virtual machine. And for that, we're gonna need a Linux operating system image. Just like you would take your laptop, your physical laptop, and if you wanted to install Linux Ubuntu or any other distribution on it, you would have this Linux operating system image on a USB or a disk or whatever, and you would attach that to your laptop and you would install that from that USB, right? The same way we need a Linux image that we're going to install into our VM. and those operating system images usually have .iso extension, ISO. And if I type in Ubuntu, downloads, on this website here, ubuntu.com/download, you actually have all Ubuntu installation images. And here I want to mention that VirtualBox and Ubuntu, they're both free, or generally Linux is free. So basically we don't need any type of license. We can just download them and use them for free, which is actually pretty amazing. Because if you want to use Windows, for example, if you want to install Windows operating system in your virtual machine, then you would have to have a Windows license, right? So in our case, we're gonna need Ubuntu Desktop because I want to have a graphical user interface in my Ubuntu installation. So I'm gonna click on it. And on this page, we're seeing the Ubuntu versions that we can download. We have the latest one, which is 22.10, and we have a slightly older version, 22.4, which has the letters LTS at the end. So LTS basically stands for long-term support. And this means that this specific version is actually the one now which will be supported by the Ubuntu team or Ubuntu developers. So usually you want to download the versions that are supported by the developers of the technology. And I'm just going to click on download and it should start automatically. And as I said, it has the ISO extension. So basically you could use this Linux Ubuntu installation file to install Linux on a virtual machine, but also on a physical laptop, right? So if you wanted to install this on your computer directly without the hypervisor, you would actually use the same ISO image. And the ISO file is around 3 GB, which means it might take a while to download. And I have the Ubuntu installer on my laptop, so we can actually use it now. I'm going to go back to my VirtualBox window. And if you click Settings and then Storage, you're able to select the icon next to the optical drive to upload your operating system image to be installed. So I'm going to click here and select Choose Disk File, and we're going to select this ISO image that we downloaded. Once we have added this image, we can start the virtual machine. And as you see, Ubuntu installation is actually starting. And now we have this step-by-step installation guide where you basically choose your language and different configurations like your time zone, etc. to install Ubuntu. So we have English here. We're going to do install Ubuntu. And again, choose the language. I'm going to choose German because that's my keyboard layout. And continue. I would leave everything on the defaults. Continue. And here you see this warning that says that erase disk and install Ubuntu option will basically delete all your programs, documents, photos, whatever in all operating systems. Now, don't be afraid of this warning because the disk that this refers to is actually the virtual disk that we allocated to our VM, right? So our main operating system's disk will not be affected. This is really only the part that we allocated for VM, which means that erasing that virtual disk will not affect our main host. So you don't need to worry here. And the reason you have this warning and it sounds so scary is because, as I said, this installation image is actually also for the physical computers, right? Not only for virtual machine installations. So obviously on a physical machine where you're installing it on your whole computer without a hypervisor, then you may consider the warning that everything will be erased on your computer. In our case, we're starting with a blank virtual disk anyways, so it doesn't matter. And I'm going to do install now. And again, we have this dialog. Do you really want to change or rewrite the disk? To be really sure, as I said, this is just a virtual disk, so go for it and continue. That's my location. And now we're going to create the Linux user. And let's call it Ubuntu password. And I'm going to check login automatically and continue. And while it's installing and downloading different stuff, it actually shows you all these things that you can install additionally, like music players and some other applications, but we're not going to need any of those. And as I mentioned previously, this Linux operating system that we're installing now on virtual machine doesn't actually know that it's on a virtual machine. So everything that it does is exactly the same way as you would install Linux operating system on an actual physical machine. So the steps are really the same. So installation completed and we're actually good to go. I'm going to restart. While the VM is restarting, remove the disk image now that the installation is complete. Click Devices, Optical Drive and Remove. And we should see Ubuntu Desktop in our virtual machine window. I'm going to do skip and next. You need to confirm some settings here and we're good to go. So basically you have all these applications that are installed by default, including a Firefox browser and the Linux command line. Now, first of all, you see that the input-output devices, like obviously the screen, but also mouse and keyboard, they're all responsive here. So basically you are sharing these resources also between your main operating system, so you can use it here, but also inside the virtual machine. However, other than that, everything is completely isolated. So whatever is running inside and whatever we're doing here is completely hidden and isolated from the host operating system. So before we continue with Linux, let's actually see some of the other options that we can set on our virtual machines from the VirtualBox. So first of all, if I want to shut down my virtual machine, I have several options. One of them is saving the machine state. So that means that basically whatever state you were in, for example, you have a browser open here with some tabs, you have terminal window open, maybe you have an editor where you are writing some code, you can basically save that state. So all these open tabs like this. So after some time, if you want to go back to your virtual machine and basically continue working, then you can just click Start and you're going to see your virtual machine window exactly as you left it. Another option is just powering off the machine, which basically just shuts down your virtual machine. It's basically just like shutting down your computer, right? So doing a basic shutdown here. Another thing that may be very interesting, especially if you're using the virtual machine to basically learn something, you may want to be able to copy and paste between your host and the virtual machine. And as I said, the mouse and keyboard is active in both. By default, you can't basically just copy a text here and paste it in a virtual machine window. It's not going to work. However, you can actually enable that in the settings, advanced, and right here, shared clipboard. So you can basically set this so that you can only copy stuff from the host to the guest, vice versa, or you can do it bidirectional. And as I said, this will make it convenient if you want to basically copy some commands that you have on your operating system editor or whatever, and you want to basically just paste in a terminal, or maybe you have a link that you want to open in the browser here. So that may be convenient. So I'm actually going to select that and save it. However, for this bidirectional clipboard sharing to work, we first have to install something called an extension pack for the VirtualBox. So if we go back to this VirtualBox downloads page, we have, for the same version that we installed here, we have a VM VirtualBox extension pack. And there is one installer for all the platforms. So we're going to click on that and download. So basically it's a small extra package that lets you add some functionality to your VirtualBox. So I'm going to click on it and install and agree on the licensing. And there you go. The extension pack was successfully installed. However, there is one final thing we need to do here so that the copy pasting can work. So I'm going to open the virtual machine first. And right here on the top, you have a couple of options. One of them is devices. And here we have something called guest editions. So guest editions package is actually the one specifically enabling this copy paste or drag and drop functionality. And if I click on insert guest edition CD image, to run the installer script, open the contents of the disk drive, right click autorun.sh and select run as program. Authenticate. So the guest editions installer ran. We can click to return. And if I click on here, you see this is the folder actually where all these runners and installers are located. And we can unmount it. And now let's actually test the functionality. So I'm gonna copy the URL from my host and try to paste it right here. And there you go. And the same way you can paste commands from your host machine to the terminal. So if I'm reading a tutorial and if I found some really large command that I don't want to type in, I can just copy it here on my host, again, back to the terminal, paste, and there you go. So that's how you set up clipboard sharing between the host and the virtual machine. This is very convenient if you're learning or testing out stuff in your VM. Another thing which is also very interesting is that by default, virtual machine actually runs in its own virtual network, which is completely isolated from your host's network, right? So your laptop, your computer is running on your home network. However, the virtual machine is not in that same network. And if you actually scanned all the devices on your home network, you won't see your virtual machine on it. And the same way, if someone accessed your virtual machine's network and basically hacked into it, they won't be able to access your home network because, again, they're isolated, which is good for security. And that's how it's set by default. However, you can also change that and basically add your virtual machine to the same network as your host operating system. So it's going to get an IP address within the same network. And you can change that settings in the network tab here. However, we don't need that, so we're going to leave that at the default. And there are some other things that you can basically share between the host and the guest operating system, like shared folders, etc. Just note that when you start basically sharing stuff between the host and guest operating systems, like sharing files and folders and basically this clipboard and sharing network, it may be convenient because you may have use cases for that. However, in that case, we're going to be making holes in this isolation between the host and guest operating systems, right? Which is great because the guest operating system cannot affect the host, the main operating system, because they're completely isolated. However, if you start sharing resources, then you are disrupting that complete isolation. So just important to be aware of that. So with this type of sharing and the settings, you may be compromising security. In our case, the only thing we shared is clipboard and everything else will stay the same. And since we have Linux Ubuntu set up, in the next video, we're going to go through Linux operating system and learn some basics of it, starting with the Linux file system.